Hi everybody, my name is Carl and I'm an alcoholic. And I would like to thank Brett and the committee for asking me to speak. I can tell you that after they chose me to speak, they decided not to raise the price of the registration. And I see this morning that, I guess I'm supposed to start with my sobriety date. My sobriety date is Halloween of 1981. And that is due to the grace of God in this program, Alcoholics Anonymous. I notice that we do not have a signer this morning. That's a good thing. There's some things that don't look good in sign. And I never really know entirely what I'm going to say. I'm operating at a bit of a, I have a lie detector here. Some members of my home group are here, so they're going to tell you when I'm lying. You know, and I believe my sponsors out there. I have sponsees out there, some folks that know me. So I'm probably going to have to stick to the truth. But so we'll try them out here. I didn't really tell anybody that I was speaking. And okay, that's a lie. And no, yeah, and I guess actually, well, I didn't tell many. Well, yeah, okay, I circled my name on the flyer, and before I passed it out. But yeah, I have this thing. But I hope everyone's really having a good time here at the convention. And what I'd like to do, I'd like to have some fun this morning. I'd like to start off with my favorite AA, what could be an urban legend. It might be the truth. I have no idea. But essentially it goes like this, and that is that a sponsee and a sponsor were going through the steps, and so the sponsee says to a sponsor, well, what about sex? And the sponsor said, well, real easy. Go to the top of page 69. Well, all sponsees are dyslexic, so he went to the top of page 96. And here's what he read. Do not be discouraged if your prospect does not respond at once. Search out another alcoholic and try again. You are sure to find someone desperate enough to accept with eagerness what you offer. Or as an old timer once said, he says, you know, if you're new to Alcoholics Anonymous and you're sitting there looking at someone across the room of the opposite sex and you're thinking the odds are good, well, you're bound to find out or the goods are odd. Okay, that's the comedy portion of it. I was a late bloomer. I was raised in a loving family. My mother and father drank, but neither one of them drank to excess. My father liked to have a beer after he played golf, and I probably would have taken up drinking earlier in my life, except for one thing. When I got to high school, I was preparing to. They had to give me a bunch of shots, and I was just terrified of shots. I did this weird thing. I'd pass out, and so this doctor told me I had to get all these shots before I could go to high school, so he said, but if you lay down, you know, it'll be okay. You probably won't pass out if that happens. So I did that, and I walked out into the waiting room, and I passed out and went into convulsions. And so they took me to a medical center, and they did a I know. Thank you, Dave. They did an electroencephalogram that they attached all these electrodes to my head, and so I that night my mother took me into the kitchen, says, we need to talk. Says, there's something you got to know. And I said, okay. So we're sitting there, and she says, you have epilepsy. And like I said, alcoholics, short attention span, ADD, and certainly this one. And it really distressed me because what I thought she said was that I had leprosy. But I had to take this medication, and I was told then that I would not be able to drink on this medication. I really hadn't drank before, and that was not a problem. And so then as I got older, I applied for a driver's license, and I just, and it had all these diseases and things. Do you have this? And I checked epilepsy, and they said, no driver's license for you. So essentially what happened is my father, he never really believed I had it, and he sent me to this fella, and this fella says, this neurologist, and they did a bunch of tests, and essentially found out that I did not have epilepsy. And so I had my first drink in my senior year in high school, and we went to a party. We had some relatives in St. Louis that had done quite well, and they had like 200 people over their house every year for Christmas, and they had a place down south and made their own wine and all this stuff. And my grandmother said, well, let's let Carl have a glass of wine. I think Carl should have a glass of wine. And so I drank that wine, and that wine tasted like three things to me. It tasted like more. It tasted like more now. And it tasted like me. It's finally all about me. And so I asked my brother, who was 5 years younger, I said, well, I want you to go in there and put some of that other hard liquor in the wine, because I knew that this, as much as it was doing, it wasn't doing enough. But what it was doing was something that I just wanted to, to increase the effect of that. And so he did that, and I got quite drunk that night and went home, and my mother had to leave, and so she was gone, and I was left home drunk with my brother, and I ran out onto the front porch in my underwear, and I screamed out into the neighborhood, "Merry blanking Christmas" to everybody. And my brother looked at me, and what he saw made him start crying. And that's kind of an important benchmark in my story. And after that, it was off to the races. I mean, it was get as much alcohol, any kind of alcohol, wherever I could get it. We tried everything from robbing my mother's liquor cabinet to these little bottles of tips they had, which were 60% alcohol. We'd try to, any way we could to get alcohol, we did that. And then after I graduated from high school, I went down to Amarillo, Texas, to live with my father and go and start a junior college. And my stepmother made the next recommendation, which was, well, why don't you join one of those fraternities? Why don't you try to join one of those fraternities? And so I did that, and fraternities back in the 60s, I can tell you, were not about learning how to study. And they were not, learning the Greek language, although they used Greek letters and all of that stuff. It wasn't about that. It was about drinking. And everything was centered around drinking. And as much as all of that was centered around drinking, they decided that I drank too much. And they didn't want me in their fraternities. And I could tell you some awfully wild stories. And then towards the end of that, in 1 week, I had wrecked my car, and my girlfriend broke up with me, and they kicked me out of college. Because one of the things they said in college is one of the teachers said, "I don't even care if you come to class." And I thought, great, that's okay with me. And so I didn't go to many, and so I was asked leave the college, and so I thought, well, what the heck, So I went down, decided to join the Navy. I'm back up a little bit. Being a typical alcoholic, I never wanted to be me. I wanted to be someone else. I wanted to be James Bond. I had just this, I just, more than anything in the world, I want to be James Bond or be like James Bond. I want to drink like James Bond. I want to get to girls like James Bond. I want to, I wanted to be James Bond. And much to the chagrin of my date at the senior prom, I insisted taking a briefcase to the, so I went into, I signed up in the Navy and because I wanted to go into UDT, and that's what they call the SEAL team now. I wanted to go into UDT. UDT stood for Underwater Demolition Team. And so I signed up, and he says, well, we've got all these schools. You can go this school or this school. When I was in boot camp, they have this thing called classification. You take these tests to see what you're good at. And he says, well, you qualify for this school. I said, I want to go into UDT. He says, well, that's not really a job classification. You have to do something. You have to have some occupation in the Navy. I said, well, no, I want to go into UDT. So fine. So they sent me, they gave me a general job classification, and they sent me to Midway Island to clean barracks for 6 months, which was my first enlist. And all we had to do there was drink beer and look at Goonie birds. That was it. I mean, and it was just drinking every night. That was okay with me. And 3-2 beer. There was a rumor, and I don't know if it's ever true or not, but they said they had formaldehyde in it, in the beer to preserve it. And I don't know if they did or not. Certainly, I felt like I had embalmed myself several times. But so from Midway Island went to I stood there 6 months and went to a ship, and I just kept going further and further and further down. Now I can tell you, in the 60s, the Navy was a pretty good place for a drunk to hide out. It really was. They didn't. I think the treatment centers didn't start until like the early 70s. But I mean, it was drink all you can, fast you can. Liquor was cheap, and so and that's what I did. I mean, the Navy always afforded me an opportunity to, and before I was 21, there was Tijuana, real close to San Diego, so no drinking age there. So moving ahead, when I got to my fourth step. My Navy career, they were about ready to throw me out at one time. But when I got to my fourth step, I told my sponsor, I said, do I really have to write this stuff down? Because you know what? I've got this naval service record. A lot of this stuff's already documented. I mean, I'd been to captain's mast, what they call non-judicial punishment, and been in trouble. I got drunk one night and I swam over to another ship in San Diego and planted a box on another ship that said, "You've been blown up courtesy of Fort Fisher, LSD 40." And then I bragged about it the next day. And I ain't taking it serious. I just thought, let it rip, And when I went in, they have a thing you go to where you go to the legal officer, and he reviews your case and decides, whether you're going to go to captain's mast. Well, the oil shack where I worked was just a few doors down, and some kid came in and he had swim fins and goggles. So for him to review my case, I walked into his office with swim fins and goggles. This is how serious I take going to captain's mast, So. But it was just insane, and it was, and a lot of it was all about me. And I'll tell you what, I used to think, early on in sobriety, I used to think, boy, I had a good time when I was drinking. I really did, man, I had some good times. And then I realized, after a while, that those good times were often at the expense of others, and then it was all about me. And some of those times really weren't that great. And when I thought, oh my God, when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I thought, this fun's going to end. So, and of course I was lying to myself and didn't even know it at the time. But so I got, in 1974, the Navy decided in their infinite wisdom that I could ship over. So they gave me a check for $10,000 to re-enlist. And I took that check, and to kind of tell you where I was at that time, I took that check and I got in a taxi cab and I went to a Porsche dealership, and I essentially signed over that check to the Porsche dealer and got me a 914 Porsche. And I'm thinking, you know what? This is the nicest thing I've ever had in my life. I'm going to have to take care of this. And I know I probably shouldn't drink and drive. That's going to be my rule. I'm not going to drink and drive in this car. Not going to happen. And 9 days later, I was involved in an accident that was so violent it knocked the wheels off the car. And fortunately, no one was seriously hurt. I mean, I was living on God's grace. I really was. And 6 months later, I met a lady who I was my first wife. I was blind drunk. I met her at a carnival, and yeah. And I didn't even remember what she looked like. but I wanted to meet her again. And so, 3 months later we were married, and it was, I remember one night she brought home when we first got together, she brought home, said, I got a present for you. And she said, I got this quart of vodka, Next morning she says, you weren't supposed to drink the whole thing, but that's the only way I knew how to drink. It was just let it rip. It seemed like I always sought oblivion when I drank, People talk often about that magic plateau that you got to maybe your first time you got drunk or something. It was like always 100 miles an hour going past it. And I'm probably very lucky. I had a lot of guardian angels in my drinking career. I did. A lot of people saved my life. And here's what they did to save my life. They just turned my chin to the side so I didn't aspirate on my own vomit. That's what they did. And I didn't even know. I would drink myself that helpless. I was a blackout drinker. I woke up one time in a blackout on the streets of Hong Kong at 7 o'clock in the morning, encircled by a bunch of pissed off Australians. I'd made some mention about their country and kangaroos and their possible heritage. But none of that stuff bothered me. Till the very end, none of that stuff bothered me. So I'd married this lady, and one night in the thralls of passion, I decided, I told her that I would like for her to get pregnant. And so the next day, she said, did you really mean that? And I'm a liar and cheat when I'm drinking. And I said, yeah, I meant it. And so we did. She got pregnant. And I knew it was a lie. And so I went overseas and on a cruise, and my daughter was born when I was 6 months. When she was born when I was overseas, and I didn't see her till she was 6 months old. But so I'd made this bet with my wife. I said, well, if it's a boy, then I'll take you out to any restaurant, get whatever you want. But if it's a girl, then I'd like a meatloaf, and cook me a meatloaf. Love meatloaf. And she said, okay. So I was in the Philippines. We were there, import, and I, had a horrible bout that night before, and I laid there in my bunk, and my division officer came, and I just roaring headache, and he shook me, and I roll over, and he handed me a piece of paper, and the piece of paper talked about the birth of my daughter, and said, your meatloaf's in the oven. And I just dropped that piece of paper on the floor. That's how much I cared about anybody. And I went out that night drinking, and I got home from overseas, and here's this baby. And I really didn't want anything to do with that baby. I didn't love that baby. I never wanted that baby. But you know what? God does kind of operate in mysterious ways, and I'll never forget the time that I fell in love with her. When I fell in love with my daughter, she was 1 year old. It was her birthday, and she was walking in the front door of the apartment, and my heart fell out of my chest at that moment. And
we need batteries. You're gonna have to speak up.
And I fell in love with her, and I gave my heart over to this child. But I had not stopped drinking. But the Navy had always provided me an opportunity to leave town, and so I was still drinking, and it was getting worse, and it was getting worse. And so essentially what happened was this. I'd made this promise that this was one promise. This was the promise. This was the line I would never cross. My daughter will never see me drunk. That ain't going to happen. Then Halloween, 1981, we went over to a neighbor's for a Halloween party. And I took a bottle of scotch over there, and I went through that, really quick, and then started getting into other folks' alcohol. Then I woke up the next morning, and I was in their guest room, and the situation was not that different. The situation, I just thrown up all over everything. It was a horror story, and I felt like someone had driven a railroad spike through one of my temples. And I got up, and I walked home. And I walked through the house, and I sat on the back porch. And my daughter, she was 5, fixing to turn 6, and she walked out on the back porch, and she looked at me, and what she looked at made her start crying. And I knew in that instant that I was a slave to alcohol. There was no promise I could ever keep. None whatsoever. Okay. And so I went to the bedroom, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I just started crying, big old crocodile tears. Shoulders were heaving, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And so my wife said, well, maybe you ought to try Alcoholics Anonymous. She'd watched some program called Knots Landing. So it's not just wearing wins that get us here, you know. So, and some fella on that went to Alcoholics Anonymous, so maybe I should. And I walked into my first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, and I had no idea what was going to happen, what they were going to do. Maybe some psychodrama, something. And so I walked in, and not really hearing anything, not knowing what's going on, and I thought, well, maybe somebody will come over. I stood there for a minute, and I thought, well, somebody come over here and talk to me, or do something, or tell me what's going on. And so what happened was, two elderly ladies walked over and said, "Hey, Bub, could you help set up some tables?" You know, and so I did that, and so they had this young girl. She was probably early 20s, and she read How It Works, and I thought, wow, she can really write, you know. Man, that's pretty good, you know. Journalism student, probably. And I didn't, you know, but a very important thing happened after my first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. Here's what happened. Someone walked up to me after the meeting, and his name was Steve, and Steve said, "Carl," and he took me over to the literature table and says, "Looky here, Carl," says, "here's a wear and win. This isn't the only Alcoholics Anonymous meeting in San Diego. You know, we got them all over. We got them every day of the week, every time of the day, and you need this." And he put this wear and win in my hand, and the other thing he said is, "Carl, this is a big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. You really need to get one of these. You're going to hear a lot of things said in Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, but this is a text. This is the core of Alcoholics Anonymous right here, and you need this." And so shortly after that, I asked Steve to be my sponsor, and Steve said, "Okay, I have a condition." I said, "What's that?" He said, "You must read the first 164 pages." Says, "You don't have to do it all at once. You can do it, you know, a little at a time." And so I was going to meetings, and I was, and you know, and I was, and the meetings were the same as other meetings. They read How It Works, but you know, how it works. No, get to the good part. Let's share. Carl share, you know. And so I wouldn't listen to How It Works. Well, when I got to chapter 5 and read How It Works, I called up Steve and said, "Steve, these 12 steps, this isn't going to happen. This step 5, this step 9, I can't do that." And Steve, Carl is one syllable, and he would make it 2. Carl. Let's look at the step with the 1 in front of it. And that's how my journey through the steps began. But unfortunately, Steve was going through a divorce, and he started going to other meetings, and so I quit going to so many meetings, and I quit regulating which meetings I went to with the wear and win. And I started regulating which meetings I went to with a TV guide. Hill Street Blues? No, I ain't going to that meeting. You know, Taxi? No, I ain't going to that meeting. And it got bad. And it got worse. And I was miserable. And so a very important thing happened. Someone saved my life in Alcoholics Anonymous. And here's how they saved my life. They told me the truth. You know, it says, and I've never been a person who feels like it ever does any good whatsoever to berate another alcoholic. And surely enough, you know, it tells us in the big book that never talk down to an alcoholic from any moral or spiritual hilltop. Simply lay out the kit of spiritual tools for his inspection. Show him how they work for you. Offer him friendship and fellowship. Tell him that if he wants to get well, you will do anything to help. So here's what happened. I told the fellow who was going to become my next sponsor, Don, I said, Don, I got sober with some of these folks. I've been here for 8 months now, and it's getting better for these people. They're getting better. When's it going to get better for me? Don said, Carl, I've heard you share and gotten to know you. I've got some bad news. It's not going to get any better for you. Carl, I have every reason to believe that you're going to drink. Unless you start working these steps. Unless you start getting you a sponsor. Unless you get you a sponsor, you start working these steps, you commit to a group, you start putting back. And so Don and I started working the steps together, and I'd like to tell you that it was a breeze that I went through them, but I resisted the steps. An interesting thing. One of the things that I've read through all of the stories in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous is that most of the folks make direct reference of how they have struggled with that third step. And I was very touched with Tracy's talk last night. And give her another hand for. The first step, okay. Second step, as my friend Katie says, it wasn't came to believe at first. At first it was came to suspect. Some of these people are getting better, and they're leading decent lives and walking with dignity and sanity in their life. And so then I came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. And so then I hit I was raised in the Baptist church in Amarillo, Texas. And the only fabric they had back then that wouldn't really wrinkle a lot was wool. So I wore wool pants, and I had to go to Sunday school in church every Sunday, and I wore these wool pants. There was one thing on this mind when I was in Sunday school in church, and that was get home, get the pants off. Get those wool pants off. And surely enough, anytime in Alcoholics Anonymous, when someone started talking about God, my legs started itching. I was one of the first cases of restless leg syndrome. Wanted to go running out of the meeting, but I finally got to a point. I'd walked away from the church many years before, and I remember an old Cheech and Chong routine that went, a fellow standing on street corners handing out literature says, I used to be all messed up on drugs. Now I'm all messed up on God. And I was afraid, I was terrified. I was going to be all messed up on God. If I just, I couldn't button my top collar and pass out religious literature and just, oh my God, that's a nerd. No, don't do that to me. I can't do that. That's not going to happen. That's it. Until I realized that I couldn't go any further. I can't go on being the person I am. I can't do this. It's not working. And so I agreed to believe in something. And you know what it was? I saw it in all of you. I agreed to believe in that. And things began to change. And so then I resisted the fourth step. I put it off, put it off, put it off. Why are you going to do the fourth step if you were never going to do the fifth? So, but something happened. By working the steps one by one, they just kind of enable us to go forward. And what happened was, and I think this is a gift of God, as I understand Him, and that is, God put someone on the other side of a table in a big boy restaurant in Poway, California, across from me, and I knew after this fella had shared with me that I had somebody I could do my fifth step with. So I might as well get started on the fourth. forth. And so, but although, to talk about my mindset at that time was I thought, how am I ever going to get through this? How am I ever going to get through this? So I put it off long enough. The first line in my fourth step was, I don't know if this is a fourth step in Alcoholics Anonymous or a suicide note. And I can tell you, you don't have to wait that long to do your fourth step. And so after I did my fourth, I couldn't wait to do my fifth. Really, it's like, let's do this. And I recently heard someone share in an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting that there's really no time frame for working the steps. But I had a pretty savvy sponsor because he knows about that. He knew about that sixth step, and he knew about Carl. He knew about Carl's ego. Because after I did it says in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, after about an hour, we examine these first 5 propositions. We're going to build this arch, walk through a free man. He knew about this. And that's what he had me do. And that was good. That was good for Carl, and I'll tell you why. Because at that point, after my fifth step, Carl's ego was smashed. And I was prime. And I was ready. I look at that sixth step of Alcoholics Anonymous. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And I almost think sometimes, should that have a question mark after it? Are we ready? And the book tells us about making that examination of the first 5 steps and how we work them. And I think too of the sixth step is an important checkpoint in the steps. I think of those rides they have at Disneyland, that they have those characters. You have to be this high to go on this ride. You have to have worked the first 5 steps appropriately to move on. And so we looked at that. And I asked God to remove my defects of character. And I am like so many others. That 8th step, took that 4th step and made that 8th step. And it's, that one we can't do. That one amend we absolutely can't do. And I had one. It was a big one. My brother-in-law wanted me to get into an insurance scam with him, and he was going to blackmail me to my wife as to something I had done overseas, and I hated him. And I told him if I ever saw him again, I'd kill him. And they lived 3 blocks away. And here's my part. Here's my part. Before that, my wife and his wife, who were sisters, and our children used to get together for birthdays and Thanksgiving and Christmas and all those wonderful occasions. And because of Carl, we didn't do that anymore. No, they're not coming in this house, and I'm not going to theirs. And because of the blackness in my heart, I used to think a long time ago, you can take a resentment, you can compartmentalize it over here, and it'll never affect the rest of your life, your sobriety. That's not true. It's like cancer. It's a cancer. A resentment is a cancer. It invades every part of your life, your serenity, your relationships. And that one did. And I remember sitting in meetings saying, yeah, you don't have an issue with anybody except this, brother-in-law and what he did. I would justify it. And people would sit there calmly and probably rolling their eyes. And finally, I said in a meeting, but if I saw that guy, if I saw him on the highway and he'd been in a car wreck and he's hurt, I'd stop and help him. And Don told me the truth. In a meeting, he said, no, you wouldn't. I knew he's right. And so, like I said, they lived 3 blocks away. And I needed to make this amends. I needed to go over and clean up my part. And so it took me 20 minutes to drive over there, 3 blocks, because I was shivering like a chihuahua trying to pass a peach seed. You want to talk about fear? I've been in hurricanes when I was in the Navy, hurricanes in the North China Sea. You know, when it was bad. It was bad. And, you know, wondered if this ship's going to make it through. Not really that afraid. Not really afraid. But at that moment, standing in that man's driveway, as I was making amends to him, I was terrified. That's fear. That's the fear they talk about in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was afraid. And I got a little less afraid. And I got a little less afraid. And I got a little less afraid as that stuff just poured off of me. And it was great. And then our families could be together again. His part didn't matter. Did not matter. It was my part. My part. And so, I guess we often hear that, you know, it's about sponsoring someone into service. I'll skip ahead because we're getting close here. Sponsoring, it's important to sponsor someone in service, and I agree with that. But I will tell you this, if you haven't been in service, you haven't been to Disneyland yet. You really haven't. I mean, it's incredible. And it's done so much for me. When I volunteered for the Missouri State Convention Committee, I have made and have lifelong friends, you know, from all over the state of Missouri. You know, I call them and I see them, and they make me smile, and I just love them to death. You know, I love all of you. As a result of this program, some wonderful things have happened in my life. I told you they're about ready to throw me out of the Navy. In 1991, I retired from the United States Navy as a Master Chief Petty Officer. They sent me. After I got out of the Navy, I went to college, and Alcoholics Anonymous told me what to do when I went to college. Spill water. I read what they gave me. I did what they told me. And I'm no smarter than any person in this room, and I graduated with honors. Just by doing the deal. Just by doing what they said. Just following these simple instructions. And I guess some really wonderful things, you know, one event I want to talk about is Don, my sponsor who I went through the steps with. He gave me a tool. He gave me a tool to go through the steps. Because like I said, I resisted the steps. And at one time, Don, he turned to me and he said, "Carl, you really need to be careful not to argue for your limitations." And I have used that in and out of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I used it once, and it was one of the greatest events in my life. What happened was, my daughter, when she was 7 years old, and I was newly sober, and she'd been on some soccer teams, and they called me, and they said, "Would you be a soccer coach?" And I used the anti-Nancy Reagan. I just didn't say no. And you know what? That was one of the most phenomenal experiences in my life. You know, and I am humbled. I am humbled by the people in Alcoholics Anonymous. We have a home group member in St. Louis, and little lady, and she lost her son, you know, to this illness. And watching her, she's a giant. She's a giant. Watching her go through that, I've watched people go through cancer in my home group, you know. And then who am I with my problems? Who am I? I watched a fella who was the head of the Iron Workers Union. He was a business agent. His son fell to his death. So he took that tragedy and he opened a restaurant for his wife, you know, so she could make a living for herself. That's Alcoholics Anonymous. The resiliency that this program gives us is phenomenal. And I I guess one of the last things I'd like to say is and talked about a little bit this morning. My father died kind of tragically, and it was a prolonged death. Essentially, he had a heart attack, and they gave him a drug called streptokinase, and they don't give it to people anymore because 1 out of 10,000, it gives them a heart attack. It gives them a stroke. And they gave him that drug. He drew the short straw, and it gave him a massive stroke. And they called me when I was in Hawaii, and so I went, and he had a year later, him and the captain of my ship had pinned the senior chief devices on my collar tabs. And when I walked into the room, his head was all thrown back because he was going through this stroke. And he spoke in this voice and said, "There's the senior chief that he'd helped pin the collar devices on. There's the senior chief." So, you know, this program gave me that. And then they operated on him, and they took out a lot of his brain, and he lost the last 20 years of his life. And so I couldn't feel sorry for myself, see, because I have a half-brother who was 16 when this happened, and he never spoke his name again as long as he lived, which is 2 years. And so I had to be there for Chris, and this program gave me that. This program gave me that, you know. And and when he died, I got to fold that American flag in my uniform and hand it to his mother and say, "Thank you for your son's service. Thank you for your son's service." So, my sponsor says, you know, so many of us, there's no path. There's no path from where we came to where we are now. How do you do that? Well, I saw a sign. Now, this is not approved literature, in a Jimmy John's restaurant. And it says there's an infinite void. It says something like there's an infinite void between more than enough. Well, it's not infinite. There is a spiritual bridge through these 12 steps, you know, that can make us and make life worth living and incredible. Thank you for being here. I love you.